Hello and welcome back, everyone. My name is Oscar Perriabello, and I'm the Senior Economics Correspondent at nextcity.org. Just by way of introduction, Next City is an online publication. We founded in 2003, and we cover cities from the lens of racial, social, and environmental justice. And we have a big solutions focus to our reporting. So I'm really excited to both dig into a little bit more about the problems, but also a little bit more about the solutions in this panel this afternoon. Since we're coming back from break, I'm going to bring up a couple of themes, a couple of phrases that stuck out to me from this morning's sessions that I think would be relevant to just kind of tee us up here for our discussion about how policies and investments shape spatial injustice and displacement. So, this morning we heard phrases and words like marginalization, erasure, and dispossession, serial forced displacement, ripping people from land they love, not once, but repeatedly. Cycles of rupture and attachment. And these are very big, messy problems. And I want to make sure we say that explicitly up front. These are big, messy problems. And today we're gonna kind of slice them down, slice into them in a couple of specific ways with each of our panelists. And I think it'll get to some more, let's say, tangible bits of the problem, not the entire problem, but bits of the problem, and what are some of the different things, policies, initiatives, themes, even just lived experiences to keep in mind as we're all going about our work. So let me quickly introduce our panel, and we're going to have we're going to have a discussion amongst the four of us. And of course, we'll have a Q&A at the end. I'll be listening in and following your questions along throughout the conversation. But let me introduce our panel first. So we have with us Michael Bader, an associate professor of sociology at American University. And we have Thomas Mitchell, who is the 2020 MacArthur Fellow and professor of law and co-director of the program in real estate and community development law at Texas A&M University. And we have Megan Venable Thomas, who is the director of cultural resilience initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners Incorporated. So, I'll also note Megan has a doctorate of her own in public health. So we have a mix of both academic and practical perspectives to bring to this conversation today. So, in listening to the presentations this morning and thinking about this big, messy problem of spatial injustice, one way I thought about organizing the discussion we'll have for you today in this panel is to think about conventional narratives versus what actually happens on the ground in reality throughout history in this country. Conventional narratives, while they may be false in many ways, for better or worse, oftentimes for worse, they guide policymaking, they guide research, they guide media discussions and the questions that we as journalists ask about these subjects and these stories, the policies and the solutions. And so I want to acknowledge conventional narratives, and I'm gonna go through some of those and actually ask our panelists to talk about why those conventional narratives don't ring true. So, Thomas, let me come to you first and think about, okay, so spatial injustice is a problem. Displacement, ripping people from the land repeatedly is a problem. And the conventional narrative of, let's say, property rights, supposed to be sacred in the United States, right? Sacred, and they've been denied from certain communities, indigenous communities, Black communities. They haven't just been, but your work and the research you've done and the work you've done in law and policy looks at how even when property rights do get extended to Black communities in the United States, even that isn't enough, because, and you'll tell us why that's not enough. So Thomas, let me toss that question your way.
Yes, thank you. This is a great panel. I'm really excited to be part of it. So I think in terms of the beginning, we need to recognize that African Americans, up until the time of emancipation, towards the end of the Civil War, had the status as enslaved people of being considered property themselves. So it's a pretty remarkable turnaround to go from being considered property yourselves to theoretically having the rights of every other individual, at that time, white men, to get property rights, including ownership. And I think that change oftentimes in status, sometimes it's assumed that they just easily go from being enslaved to being somehow similarly situated, which they weren't. But even those who kind of achieved property ownership, what I think has oftentimes been overlooked is that group of property owners who constituted essentially the upper middle class for the Black community back in 1910. W.E.B. Du Bois had a study where 80% of the Black upper middle class in this country were African-American farm owners. That group represented, in many ways, an existential threat to a society built on white supremacy. So oftentimes we talk about lynching, and in the popular narrative, those who were the greatest victims were Black men who were deemed to have an inappropriate communication or relationship with white women. In fact, a disproportionate number of those who were lynched were African-American property owners, because they were a threat to, as I indicated, to this notion of white superiority. And so I think that the ability of African-Americans to secure property rights, to maintain property rights, has always been contingent, has always been challenged, and in many ways, for a couple of reasons. One, this notion of racial inferiority. And second, as a group that has had rights, but who overall have been politically and economically disadvantaged in some ways, to serve the goal of other individuals or sometimes governments, it's the least path of resistance is to take property that African Americans and other historically subordinated minorities have owned, because it's just easy. It's easier. So I think those kind of twin reasons kind of account for why we African Americans in the first instance have had such difficulty securing property rights, but then when they secure such rights, it's kind of on this foundation that makes their ownership, if it's ownership or other rights, inherently kind of insecure and often second rate.
And can you talk a little bit about, Thomas, the mechanism? So, there's eminent domain is one way perhaps African American property rights have been undermined, but it's not the only way. And there's also heirs property, which you've looked at extensively and done a lot of work around. And that's another mechanism that it's sort of a silent, unseen, not really talked about, but pervasive in the African American community.
Yeah, so let me just talk about certain legal processes that have led to substantial property loss within the African American community. And in addition to those, I've already referenced extra legal, lynching, violence, intimidation, that have played a substantial role in American history. But just in terms of the legal ones, you have eminent domain, and you have foreclosure, you have tax sales, you have something called adverse possession. But in my work, there's an archaic or arcane property law called partition law that turns out to have been an incredible tool for those who are predatory, real estate speculators, developers, investors, and others who essentially wanted to take African-American owned property against the will of those families. You mentioned that there's heirs property. So heirs property is a great example of what I was talking about in terms of second-rate ownership. So what is heirs property? Heirs property is property that families acquire mostly because they don't have a will or some type of other estate plan. They then also tend to be property owners that we refer to as being property rich but cash poor. And these are owners that typically have a substantial lack of access to affordable legal services. So how is it that it turns out that the African American community, in terms of their property ownership, has a substantial percentage of heirs property? It's been estimated in some places that the ownership constitutes about 50 to 60% of the property African American families own. So how did African Americans come to own this kind of heirs property? One, as I indicated, that though that initial group of African Americans who acquired property after emancipation really it can only be seen as just being incredibly heroic. I mean, most Americans don't know that African Americans actually ever owned any substantial property, but between the end of the Civil War in 1910, 1920, African Americans acquired somewhere between 60 and 20 million acres of agricultural land. And that land base now is down to about 3 million acres. But one of the pathways is this heirs property, because most of those families at that time did not have access to lawyers. Almost all the lawyers in these rural southern counties were white. It was not good for business for them, for the most part, to be seen as representing African American clients. And also these families they might have had land, but they didn't have much other wealth. And so they did not then have the tools that wealthier families have to structure their ownership to ensure that it has continuity of ownership over time and that's governed by kind of rational rules that allocate rights and responsibilities. So we're in the time of COVID where, there's heightened awareness in our society, COVID, George Floyd, various racial gaps, obviously in the healthcare system, in the criminal justice system, in K through 12 education and higher education as well. But there's one gap that's little known in our society, and it turns out we have a massive racial will-making or estate planning gap. One study out of Washington, or one of the economists is from Washington University in St. Louis, showed that only 23% of African Americans have a will or an estate plan, whereas 55% or 57% of white American families have a will. Even the most educated African Americans in that study only had a will or estate plan, only 32 or 33%. And that's at least African Americans with a college education. And that has severe implications in terms of being able to maintain ownership over time, because there is this law of partition that essentially allows any one of the common owners and heirs properties, what we refer to as common real property ownership. So it's a group of people that own property together. And this law of partition historically allowed any one of the common owners to walk into court, file a legal action, and request a court to order a forced sale of the entire property, even if all of the other common owners, 99% or more, wanted to maintain ownership. And courts, up until recently, routinely were ordering these forced sales. And these sales had the other negative impact of selling the property for well below market value, oftentimes for a fire sale price. So these families not only lost their property, they were stripped of a substantial amount of their generational wealth at all, and disproportionately for African Americans in terms of their asset portfolios, it's disproportionately their real estate or their real property. So this caused these families.
All right, thank you, Thomas. And let me bring in Megan to talk about something sort of how we end up having to deal with different consequences now because of some of the issues you're talking about, Thomas. So not every family who was subjected to heirs property challenges left the South and went to the North or the West in the Great Migration, but it was a factor. There were many other factors that contributed to Black families leaving the South and going to other parts of the country. But the fact is, we're still living with that immense movement today. Before the Great Migration, 90% of African Americans in the U.S. lived in the South. After the Great Migration, nearly half lived in other parts of the country. So we're talking millions of folks leaving places where they were subjected to things like the issues you're talking about, Thomas. And they went to the north, and they made, as Mindy Fuller talks about in her work, they made homes of these neighborhoods in the north, in Newark, in Harlem, on the south side, west side of Chicago, on the west side of Oakland. They made homes of these neighborhoods, and now it's happening. It's starting to happen again in some of those places. And so, Megan, can you talk a little bit about how your work is part of recognizing and acknowledging and respecting what happened? So folks were displaced. They came to other neighborhoods that they came to love, and now for different reasons they're being displaced again today. And you kind of acknowledge and build on that recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Oscar. And thank you, Thomas, for that foundation. I think it's really critical to understand the historical implications that now impact, right, current lived experiences of places and spaces of people of all different cultures, but particularly when we think about Black communities. And so when we talk about spatial justice or injustice, I think it's important to not only focus on the physical spaces, but we have to focus on people's experiences in navigating those spaces. And so if we recognize the need for justice, then we understand that harm has been done, right? And we've talked about these generations of harm, but also these present day harms. And so spatial justice really invites a relational aspect to it that I think requires folks to think about relationships through human connection and community for the sake of the common good. And so folks are here building communities with what they have, and there's real value there. And I think one of the conventional narratives that we are combating today, particularly around gentrification and displacement, is that one, housing is a commodity, and if you can afford it, then you get it, right? Versus housing being a human right, and how do we ensure that people have access to thriving communities and value not only housing stock, but also people's lived experiences, their culture, their skills and strengths that have come from a generation or generations of resilience. Right. The fact that I am standing here as an African-American woman, descendant of slaves, is a demonstration of my community's resilience. Right. It's almost unfathomable to think about what people in my community have experienced. And so how do we really start to tap into, one, understanding and normalizing the trauma of our experiences, but two, really starting to think about what do healing-centered approaches look like in community development that start to value different things, not just housing stock, not just cost, right, and the monetary capital of your investment, but value people. When we're talking about human-centered displacement, we also have to start to talk about, well, then what does human-centered maintenance, community, what does that look like? And so what we've really been trying to look at is that, what we've seen in communities time and time again is that communities most resilient in the faces of disaster, whether it be climate change or earthquakes or floods or even just human disasters, right? That they're not just structurally sound, that they are socially connected. And so what does it look like to invest in social connection? What does it look like to bring a lens of healing to the work that we do, and to really value folks' inherent strengths and skills who are on the ground, living in community as valued collaborators in the ways in which we do design and development? And how do we think about developers, designers, architects, real estate agents as not just practitioners in those fields, but also cultural practitioners that are there to have a level of understanding about their client who is in the community that is existing there and has been there before they arrived?
Yeah. And when you start to view communities with this lens of like acknowledging the culture and the resilience that's there, it starts to change. I find it starts to change the way I even talk about or report about community development or affordable housing. You know, a lot of policymakers and a lot of the media like to say and report about the headlines, like, oh, we built 200,000 units of affordable housing over the past 10 years. But the process of where those units get built, who builds them, who owns them, who funds them, and how do you even get to live in those units? All of those other questions become more important when you think about, oh, it's not just about numbers and building more housing to lower the cost of rent, or more supply lowers the price, right? Like, it's not like it may or may not lower the price, but there's something else there besides the bottom line of how many units get built.
Absolutely. And that's the traditional, right, metric that we use in housing, is around the number of units that are produced or preserved. And so, but what research demonstrates is that brick and mortar alone does not a cultivating, thriving, sustainable community make. And that by not understanding and not having a comprehensive understanding of residents' collective lived experiences, their strengths, their skills in community, can have significant potential harmful community disruption, cultural erasure, perpetual trauma, all the things that folks have been talking about. And so really entering first with a lens of, I'm not trying to create additional harm, is even something that we should be thinking about as practitioners. And it's a demonstration, I think, around collectivism and community, because it's a clear change and shift of power to say that I'm coming into a place not as holding this power over others, but holding power with you. How is my positionality as an expert, not one here to direct what should happen and what direction your housing and live situation, a thing that, right, is one of the most important things that we actually navigate in our lives on a daily basis. But how am I here to be a partner? And I think this shift allows the redistribution of concentrated power from an individual, not only at the personal level, but also at the structural levels of our society, because it shifts from the individual to the collective. And so really starts to have a more healing centered lens that says, this is not about me, but this is about us, because I recognize our interdependence in community.
Thank you, Megan. So Michael, let me bring you now into this discussion, and let me just play out the scenario here we're thinking about. So, let's say your family is one that maybe came up through slavery in Mississippi, emancipated, got land somehow, made it productive as it could, but through eminent domain, through heirs property issues, you weren't able to keep that land. Now you're forced to move to maybe, let's say, the south side of Chicago. You moved there in the 60s or 70s. Maybe there are jobs there. That's why you moved there. But those jobs slowly go away because of the industrialization. And now you leave. And so you see in Chicago, you have neighborhoods like Englewood, for instance, on the south side, which in the 70s still had 130,000, 150,000 people in Englewood. Today, only 30,000 people living in Englewood. This is one neighborhood in Chicago. And where do they go? Where do those folks go? Some of them go back to the South. Some of them move out into the suburbs. And that's because the jobs went away or they weren't able to access other jobs because of racial discrimination in the labor markets. And so they're forced to once again leave and go out into the suburbs. Sometimes it's displacement because of development that may occur, because let's say your local or state government decides to build a highway through your neighborhood and pushes you out. And that further makes your property rights contingent. It makes your property rights challenged. It devalues your property. So now you're forced to move out to the suburbs. And Michael, your research actually looks at this issue of like, so now what happens to those folks? Because, you know, there's a conventional narrative out there that says, oh, you know, move out to the suburbs, better schools, better, you know, it's you have more space, you have a backyard. Isn't it going to be nicer? Is it going to be a better life for you? But your research points to a different kind of narrative.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me here. And it's slightly intimidating going after Thomas and Megan because they make such wonderful points, and I'm just happy to be here. So I really appreciate your question, Oscar, because when you framed the conversation that we're having, you said to think about conventional narratives and how those fall short. And one of the ways that I think we oftentimes forget about inequality in America is that the majority of inequality now is in suburbs, not in central cities. So the majority of poverty is in the suburbs, and that's true across racial groups, but especially for Black and Latino Americans. It's a little bit different for Asian Americans, given immigration patterns. But one of the things that I think we often forget is how important the suburbs are. And we do have this narrative that the suburbs are better. And in many ways they are. And I don't want to discount that. And I think there are a lot of folks, I don't want to discount the fact that there are many folks, including many people of color, who chose to move to the suburbs because they did have more opportunities than what were available in cities, which were under-resourced because of past racial discrimination and the kind of dog whistle urban politics and violence that had come through in politics from, you know, at least 1940s through 1970s and 1980s. And so for many Black Americans, the suburbs were a place of refuge. And I want to shout out the work by Karen Lacey, who's a sociologist at University of Michigan, who studied this process in depth and noted the importance of the suburbs. And so I think that it's really important to think about what those processes are. One of the things that is important as folks move out, however, is because we haven't done a good job investing in Black communities, especially, but communities of color generally in the United States, is that often when that suburbanization happens, the kinds of resources upon which those institutions were built are no longer there because we rely so heavily in the United States on local tax funding. The local tax funding goes down as, you know, those neighborhoods in the suburbs that we traditionally think of as better, and in many ways, like I said, are. Because there is more space, there's more room, you know, for kids to run around. The schools traditionally have been better, but because we rely so much, as Megan has mentioned and said so well, on property taxes and the idea of housing as property, that we don't. The insufficient demand means that property values are often declining in neighborhoods where Black folks are living in a way that is detrimental to the long-term prospects of Black communities. And we're not seeing the types of investments that have traditionally gone into those suburbs. And this is one of those things, I know there are folks, you know, joining this who are part of institutions. And I think that's where a huge institutional response can come in, rather than focusing on kind of the hip new neighborhood in Chicago or in DC or New York, or, you know, all the places that are gentrifying, actually placing institutional resources in suburbs, especially those suburbs where property values have been declining, where, as you said, Oscar, jobs may not be as prevalent, are the kinds of things that institutions can do in a very clear and meaningful sense to make real strides to overcome that. And I'm thinking especially of medical care institutions, because the medical care can be provided. There's there's mountains and mountains of evidence that Black folks travel farther for primary care, travel farther for emergency care, travel farther for specialty care. And so I think, you know, as especially medical institutions and nonprofits are thinking about where to house their investments, housing them in the suburbs, especially those that have been not receiving the kinds of investment that we traditionally think about the suburbs, are a real clear and compelling way to overcome spatial injustice with the resources that those organizations have. And so I think that's something that is really important and overlooked. And I think there's also, I mean, just, I don't want to, there are certainly many problems with capitalism, but as long as we're going to work in the capitalist framework, there's also, I think, money being left on the table. So one of the things we did in the DC area, so we interviewed folks from all over DC, so DC plus all of its surrounding jurisdictions. And what we found was that half of Black folks in the DC area said that they did not believe that the businesses in or near their neighborhood thought about people like them when they were making business decisions. I mean, half, that's incredible. I mean, it's not incredible. We know what has happened in the United States, but this is an area with one of the largest and wealthiest African-American populations in the country. And if half of African-Americans in this metropolitan area don't feel like they're being served by commerce in their area, that's a huge lost opportunity, both for those people themselves, but also for potential small businesses. And Oscar, I know a lot of your work is focused on this in terms of thinking about investments, about small business loans, about the types of things that we could be doing in those neighborhoods that are making sure that Black folks are served in the same way that white folks are. And so those are a couple of the kind of conventional narratives. I really like your framing, Oscar, of thinking about this in terms of conventional narratives. I think thinking in terms of investing in places rather than thinking about the problem of being flight is that we're not investing the resources we need in communities who do have the kind of resiliency that Megan was talking about, who have faced all of the problems that Thomas has talked about and still are resilient. And we're missing those opportunities, but then it's also a missed opportunity for the market where we could actually be increasing the domestic product of metropolitan areas, and we're leaving that money on the table as well.
Yeah, what you make me think about, Michael, is how when white flight happened, let's say, out of inner city neighborhoods and into the suburbs, the neighborhoods left, and who followed them? The banks followed them, and the small businesses popped up around those neighborhoods along because the banks were able to give that little bit of liquidity. And you had at one time, more Black-owned banks. We used to have more than 130, 160 or so Black-owned banks. Now we have less than 20. And there are reasons too why there weren't as many banks in Black communities. I mean, one of the things is the community banks' main investors have been other business owners who look like them, right? Like, and this is why you're able to move or start new banks in white communities. You have a lot of potential in shareholders around. You have the previous sort of bank professionals who maybe they close the bank or they move the bank out of the inner city into the suburbs, and that wealth followed white folks around, that banking power, and that comes with property tax revenues, because now you have the bank in the neighborhood. The bank wants to make sure that the property values go up in the neighborhood, so it's going to make sure that the potential homeowners for that neighborhood are able to access mortgages, whether they're funded through Fannie Mae or by some other means. They're gonna move that money with them to those new neighborhoods. And when you have limitations on housing markets or small business markets, it's harder to do that. You can't just take the bank with you to the suburbs if you don't have them. I mean, that's the thing, is we don't have as many of those banks around. So what do we do? This is such a big, messy problem, and each of you are looking at different aspects of this. And with regard to heirs property, Thomas, you have in that small slice of the problem, you have come up with a policy shift, or a sort of model law that different states are starting to adopt now to kind of deal with this problem of heirs property. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, some of the basics around what this law does, but I think more importantly, can you talk a little bit about the political process in the places where this law has been adopted so far, and how important that is to kind of drive popular support around this issue that seems small, but is actually fairly significant.
Yeah, so one of the things we were talking about narratives, there's a couple that's relevant to my work. So when I first started researching this area 25 years ago, one of the narratives we were dealing with is that in these areas of property law, these laws acted in a race-neutral way. So there was almost no discussion of race. A great example is eminent domain. Most Americans who know about eminent domain probably know about Suzette Kelo, the pink house from the city of New London in Connecticut. But the popular narrative is that she's the poster child for eminent domain abuse. And when you actually start kind of interrogating that, but you realize, Suzette Kelo, and I'm not saying that, I'll be agnostic right now about whether eminent domain was appropriately used in that case, right? But you're talking about a woman who was paid 2 to 3 times the fair market value appraisal of her property. So she wasn't taken advantage of economically. And then she actually got a number of other goodies kind of thrown in, right? And we're talking about the city of New London that is still a distressed economic community with few economic tools to address its problems. It turns out with eminent domain, the majority of people in the United States who have had their property taken by eminent domain are people of color. Right around the same time this drama was playing out in New London, Connecticut, in New Orleans, right off of downtown, a neighborhood called Mid-City, you had, and this was a neighborhood with many historic homes, many famous jazz musicians had lived in Mid-City. And then there was eminent domain used that essentially raised 265 homes there, this huge swath, to make way for a couple new hospitals that arguably were not needed at all. Most of those property owners, I think 78% were African-American. Almost none of them got paid market value. But the question is, well, why isn't the African-American homeowners why aren't they the face of eminent domain abuse as opposed to somebody who got paid multiple times the value of their property? So part of my work has just been trying to tease out and interrogate whether or not these rules are race neutral, and they're obviously not. The second is that in some of these areas, eminent domain, the area of partition law that I worked in when I started, the only values that were recognized in the law were economics. And so with partition law, there used to be what I call the economics only test that totally discounted the family heritage value, the historic value of these properties, the cultural value, how these properties were important in terms of just securing affordable housing, and what would be the implications of taking away people's source of affordable housing, right? And so I think initially my work was to shine light to make it apparent that these laws were not race neutral. They had a disproportionate racial impact, and that there were these other values, as some of my other panelists have described, that were really kind of important. So the third narrative that I had to deal with was this narrative that that there could be no law reform or policy solutions. There was this notion that, and people were very explicit about it, that at the end of the day, as sad and as unjust as these laws are, the natural position for African Americans in our society is to be taken advantage of, to have their property taken away by more powerful actors who could then put it to some greater economic use. And that's sad, but just a reality. All right. So I obviously didn't accept that. And so we kind of, when I started and initially proposed ideas for this model state statute to make a fundamental reforms to this arcane law of partition, at the time, the received wisdom was nothing could be done about it. And there was actually some empirical data about that. There had been attempts in several southern states beginning in the early 1970s, right through the late 2000s, to reform this law of partition. And every attempt to reform it in any significant way met the graveyard. They all failed. So then people asked me, well, what makes you think that you could be any more successful? Some of it is a structural issue, is that we were able to because of the media, the Associated Press did this award-winning series on Black land loss in 2001. And that AP series actually got the attention of the American Bar Association. And so instead of just grassroots activists or civil rights activists at the local or state level, all of a sudden we had a combination of kind of top-down, like grass tops and grassroots working together. Where we are now is we have 18 states that have enacted the model state statutes called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. So there's 18 states that have enacted it, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But also, so obviously it hasn't failed like everybody said it was going to fail. But surprisingly, the states that are leading the way are the South. 8 of the 18 states, and the most recent one being Mississippi, have enacted into law. Okay, so to get to your question, well, how have we done that? Yeah. Part of it is shining a light that there are disproportionate impacts. But part of it is using this narrative of property rights, right? Because the narrative says it shouldn't just be property rights for white people. So we're able to kind of take advantage of that and say, fundamentally, what our act is about is enhancing property rights for all heirs property owners, irrespective of their race. And it's fundamentally about improving the property rights for these owners and preserving their generational kind of wealth. And so that narrative has been powerful. I'd say that as time has gone by, I and a few others that I worked with had what I call greater degrees of freedom to address some of the racially disproportionate impacts. There are places that are very receptive to that. One of our enactments was in Hawaii, where Native Hawaiians were being taken advantage of, including by Mark Zuckerberg. And in New Mexico, where the Latinx community historically had lost hundreds of thousands of acres of their land through partition abuse. But even in some of the southern states, when I testified in the Florida Senate a year ago, I felt that we had enough momentum, we had enough success that I could talk about some of the racial disparities in a more kind of robust way than initially I did, out of fear that would kind of sink our efforts of achieving success.
Yeah. So I think, Thomas, if I could kind of restate what I'm hearing from you, it's sort of like with the model heirs property law, you were able to kind of define and look at a problem that disproportionately affected African American populations in many places. But the solution wasn't to say, oh, we're going to fix this just for Black folks. We're going to fix the problem, the problem that happens to disproportionately affect African American communities and landowners.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Megan, are there sort of equivalents, let's say, in affordable housing, of kind of framing what the problem, affordable housing or community development? Are there ways of framing what the problem really is? And it's not necessarily like Thomas is saying, it's not necessarily it's not race neutral in the sense of like this will help all people equally, but it's a problem that disproportionately affects African Americans, and we're going to fix it not in an explicitly kind of African American way. It's just sort of looking at the landscape, the policy or the financing landscape, and saying this would make things work better for African Americans as developers or as homeowners, or
Yeah, I mean, I do think that a lot of the challenge that we're facing is our fear or shyness away of talking about race explicitly. I mean, I think, a lot of this work is race explicit. Redlining was very race explicit. That has specifically disinvested in particular swaths of the community based on who they are. And the skin that they're wrapped in. And so in order for one of my colleagues, April DeSimone, she has created an organization called Designing for Democracy and had an organization called Designing the We, talked about how until we start undesigning some of the things that we've done in community development, we can never appropriately design, right? We can't just lay some of these designs in community development on top of a lot of these issues that are so deeply rooted and policy practice based, and so structural in the way in which we do our work. But I do think, when we talk about affordable housing, and the ways in which we fund affordable housing, I think is a place that we can start. One of the initiatives that we focus on at Enterprise is we have a criteria called Enterprise Green Communities Criteria. We just did an update in 2020 of the criteria that is in 32 qualified allocation plans across the country. And the qualified allocation plans have then stipulations for developers that are tied to LIHTC and new income housing tax credits. And so in order for you to get the capital you need to do your development, you have stipulations that you must meet as a developer in order to get that capital. And that's important because it then is placing certain types of requirements, not just on the housing, the number of housing that you're building, but also the quality of the housing that you're building and the approach and process to creating that housing and the ideas about that housing that you're building. So we're talking not just about retrofitting for your building for climate change, but we're also talking about how are you engaging with residents and community members? How are you thinking about or talking about the cultural representation of the community that exists there? How are you thinking about healthy building materials? How are you thinking about healing-centered building? What does that look like in the design of your building? And so I think, some of this is even down to a narrative shift around housing. And again, just the amount of housing that we're creating versus how are we creating dignified housing? How is this housing that someone wants to not just live in and have a roof over their heads, but is able to house and home the traumas that they're experiencing out in the world, and they're coming back into a place that actually is able to hold that? How is that able to be a place where they can think through the challenges that they're experiencing? And so just even a shift around, again, what role housing plays and who deserves it. One of our former colleagues, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, did a study with residents, tons and tons of residents across the country. And that narrative that you were talking about, Thomas, around who can afford to live where and whether or not you deserve it is not just a narrative that is, social and political, but people also were like, if I can't afford to live here, I have to move. And I understand that. And so people have also, inculcated that message. And so how do we start to have a narrative shift around not just what people want and need, but what they deserve? And I think starting to have some of those conversations is a way that we are starting to shift, not just what residents feel like they want, but also the ways in which developers are thinking about developing and designing and are required to think about developing and designing.
Yeah. So let me kind of flesh that out just a little bit with you. So you're talking about the qualified allocation plans for those who may not know in the audience. So this is a key part of the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a federal program, subsidizes $12 billion, I believe $12 billion a year in low-income housing tax credits are available nationwide, but they are doled out state by state. And each state is based on population. You get a slice of that 12 billion. And each state every year has a cycle of a competitive process to get a piece of each state's piece of that 12 billion. And the qualified allocation plan is it's sort of like a guideline or manual of like, if you're applying to get these low-income housing tax credits, and your applications will be scored based on this qualified allocation plan. I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but that's sort of what it is, right? Mm-hmm. So you're saying changing the rules in how you access those federal dollars in these ways. You're not necessarily saying this is only for Black folks, but these changes will disproportionately help Black communities, Black renters, Black households, because these things we're asking you to do are the things that are consistently missing when it comes to community development and affordable housing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a easy way, but also, we talk a lot about capacity building at enterprise and how we support capacity building of developers. But also, I think a lot of the rules that we have around different developers coming to the table and their already set capacity, right? High capacity organizations are often organizations that have had a lot of investment over time, that have the capital already, right? And so you're already starting to bias towards people who, like, what does capacity mean? And who already has the assets needed to be able to do the things. And so we've been thinking about, too, how do we get rid of some of those stipulations and requirements that are cumbersome, that allow more people to come to the table and allow a larger swath of communities and developers to really be able to start solving problems for their own community. And so I think that is also another way within community development that we're trying to think about and hoping other folks will start to try and think about, to really think about what does equity look like in our practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, could you talk a little bit about how so changing who builds housing, diversifying the affordable housing developer world, I do get this. I do have this estimate from Enterprise. I think it's like 2% of commercial real estate professionals are not white men, something like that. Some crazy small percentage. So, but by changing who builds housing, how does that qualitatively change affordable housing or low-income housing developments?
Well, I think, when just the same as we were talking about banks that service people that look like them, healthcare providers that provide unbiased healthcare to people that look like them. We see it time and time again across all different types of fields in our community. And so when you have people who are from the community, right, coming with a lens of making and building for their community, there's just a different vantage point. There's just a different mindset about what they're trying to do. And thus the approach and process of doing so is different. And so I think we're trying to think about, how do we make that a process that's required for everyone to be considering, right, across the board, because ultimately that's going to improve housing for Black folks and people of color that are disproportionately impacted, but also improve housing for other people whom that is their community. And so in particular, though, if we're able to increase the representation of folks whom are from those communities, that's one way immediately that we're able to change and think about a different process that might happen in the development experience.
I mean, if I can jump in real quick, Oscar.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention too, going off of what Thomas was saying about like what's feasible, I think one of and Thomas could probably speak about this much more than I can, but I'm kind of looking at the consequences of it in my research, is that states have devolved their property zoning and other rights to localities. And that has been a major way that communities have been able to keep people of color out, but not only just people of color, but anyone who needs affordable housing out. And there are tools that the federal government can use. For example, I think the infrastructure bill is a lost opportunity where we can actually say, rather than giving block grants, which is what the Biden administration has proposed doing, that's already on a very small basis. And so you're not going to be able to do much. But if you say, we're not going to give you transportation funding for your highways if you don't take back these property requirements from localities to the state and make sure that there's affordable housing across all jurisdictions, you're not getting highway money next year. I imagine that would have a lot larger effect than trying to, top off the block grants, which isn't going to be sufficient amount of money for most state legislatures to say that it's worth it to implement the kinds of plans that are really going to be transformative to open up spaces that have traditionally been closed to the types of affordable housing that we're going to need. I mean, we are going to need a denser development, and denser development is generally good for climate change. The more densely we can build, the better off we're going to be in terms of affordable housing. It's going to create some problems in terms of displacement because you're oftentimes building on sites that are already built, and that's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. But disproportionately, the communities that are affected are those like Megan's talking about that don't have the say with developers. Whereas, in my area, two residents from a single town in Chevy Chase were able to shut down an entire mass transit development for 4 years and get the state to, have to renegotiate all of its contracts because they were, those two residents were able to hold up for so long. And so the fact that you have those disparities and the state, could take some of those back. And I think that's an area that's been lost where, and it's kind of thing that seemed impossible 2 years ago, but California just passed bills, the entire city of Minneapolis just, made quad housing by right. And so there are, I think, opportunities right now that are not just, again, are disproportionately going to affect and help Black folks and people of color, but are going to help everyone, because the more we have affordable housing and the fewer peaks and valleys we have in the housing market, the better off we're all going to be. We're going to have more equitable schools, we're going to have more equitable communities, we're going to have more equitable commercial development. All those things will generally improve areas across the entire metropolitan areas rather than just a few neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that change too. You mentioned about kind of lifting restrictions on the number of units per property. I think there was also a big bill going through California that I think the governor just signed it to kind of there's different ways it's described. It's sometimes described as banning single family housing or single family units, single family properties, I should say. The way I like to describe it is that so it's not banning single family. If the developer thinks the single family development would be better for development, they can still build single family homes. What it says is rather than having to seek an exception to build something that's not single family, developer no longer has to seek that exception. It's done by right. And so they're able to do it without having to go through a whole bunch of regulation, which then increases the price, which makes it less affordable to build duplexes and in the state of California.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can I just jump in on a couple things that?
Please.
So one of the things that we talk about these narratives, as I indicated, one of the narratives I dealt with early on was this notion that these communities of color, they had nothing, right? So part of that was manifested when I was referring to that economics only test. And then that any culture or history that they had was worthless. You see that play out in different ways. I mean, in areas where you want to displace African Americans or other people of color, you don't just talk about they have nothing affirmatively positive. You talk about deviancy, crime, drugs, prostitution. That really kind of, in some ways, was the genesis of my work. I grew up in San Francisco, born in the mid-'60s. 1970 was a high water mark for African Americans in San Francisco at about 13.5%. It's now down to 3%. So San Francisco has had the greatest loss of an African American population of any major city in the United States. But part of that was when I was growing up, the area of the city, we can call it Western Addition or the Fillmore, that the whole narrative was crime, prostitution. We got to redevelop this area. And it really, I'll put it mildly, greatly upsets me when I go back home. My mother's still there. My older sister's in the Bay Area. What you do now when you go down Fillmore, the city now has marketed it as the historic jazz district. So when they were trying to take the property, all we heard about was pimps and prostitutes and shootings. But apparently now it's, all along it was the historic African-American jazz district, which is now generating tourist dollars for the city, a city that has displaced a substantial part of the American population. Mm-hmm. I think part of it is just is recognizing that there are these values, tremendous value, economic and non-economic. On the economic front, one of the points I made in terms of actually land loss, yes, there's been a tremendous loss of African-American land, and not in addition to urban properties as a result of partition. But actually, African-Americans still own a substantial amount of land. That number I gave of 3 million, that's just the agricultural census, which captures owners, acres owned by those who own and operate a farm operation. It turns out there's a lot of African-Americans who own land where the family is no longer farming it itself. They don't have the farm operation. They're renting it to somebody else. So it turns out, at least at the time I began some of my work, or an article I highlighted in the mid-2000s, was that at that time, the USDA had done another study showing that African Americans actually owned, at that time, 7.2 million acres of agricultural land, not what the agricultural census. So part of what I was saying is that, there's still, despite systemic discrimination, years of kind of being targeted, African Americans and other minorities still have substantial assets. And the notion shouldn't be that it's inevitable for those to go down to zero. And then maybe on the back end, we'll make some claim for reparations when there hasn't been a single instance of reparations in the United States. And even among some, attorneys of color, I was hearing that narrative, oh, we'll just add it to the reparations bill. And I was like, well, why would we just sit back and do nothing when we could actually build an infrastructure of laws and policies to preserve what we have and then think about building for there. The other thing is, when we talk about Megan mentioned this, Michael mentioned this. I mean, one of the key things in my work is that this model state statute was promulgated by this incredibly elite organization that has had the longest history of developing model state statutes. It's been around since 1892. They've produced about 425 model state statutes. They're best known for the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC. Mm-hmm. But when I was selected to be the principal drafter for this Heirs Property Act, I was just the second African American ever to have served in that position. And in the entire 130-year history, there's only been 5 people of color. But the fact that I was in the room, my research was informed by the work I had done in the South, meeting with many of these communities in their homes, in churches, and community centers. I was just bringing a whole different perspective than the organization, which at that time was, 85% white men who were at least 65 years old. So part of it was that representation made a difference. The other thing I did was, for the first time, I catalyzed an effort to get grassroots organizations and community-based organizations that had not participated in these elite processes into the room. And they participated in a robust way, kind of informing those who had no experience with people of color owning anything about their perspective about what actually happens on the ground. And the last thing is, so that example was, I was one of a very few people of color ever to be in these. One of the things I say in terms of attorneys is we have underrepresentation. Only 14% of the population of the United States is African American, only 5% of those in law school, or 5% of attorneys in the United States. And it's the same with the medical profession. But one of the huge problems I've discovered is that even among African American attorneys, those who work in areas that implicate kind of economic justice or wealth building, you think property law, real estate, tax, business law, there's just a tiny percentage of African American lawyers who are in those fields. I just found out in the state of Oregon, there are only 5 African American attorneys in the entire state of Oregon who practice in estate planning. And so you have these communities, not only is there generally a lack of affordable, but many of these communities are segregated, and their knee-jerk is to think of a lawyer who would be from their group, and they have none. Or they have. So one of the things I've been trying to catalyze is among law students of color is to kind of increase their understanding or expand their understanding of what it might be to be a civil rights lawyer. And it's not, and we need African-American criminal, lawyers, but it's not just that, right? If you're going to think about economic justice and preserving wealth and building wealth, you need lawyers with a different skill set. And there's an incredible paucity of those lawyers, just like there are with the builders you mentioned. So we need to kind of think about representation, vertically in many different sectors that are grossly underrepresented. Yeah.
I think one of the things I'm hearing is spatial injustice manifests and gets perpetuated through this lack of representation. And I want to be careful to also say explicitly, tokenization is also a thing. Like it's a problem if you can change who's in the room, but if you don't change who's speaking in the room, who has a voice, who gets listened to, if you don't change the power dynamics in the room, that can be a problem. But like, this is the thing, like the lack of representation in the legal field, you mentioned going back to just who has access to a lawyer, lack of representation in the community development field, who gets to build, and how that changes how they do things as developers. And to kind of to bring in what Michael has been looking at, I would say the lack, maybe it's the lack of representation at the state legislative level leads to things like, oh, we're the state, we pick any state, and we can see which municipal governments maybe are struggling because of white flight from those areas. If we know that's happening, we have the opportunity to correct for that at the state level through state aid for local governments. We have an opportunity just to not cut state aid for local governments, because that's a thing. Like that's a choice that states constantly have made over the past decade, especially cutting aid to local governments. So representation is part of that. Is part of how that gets perpetuated, right? So yeah, and I guess it's also like representation where, like you're saying, Thomas, you're talking about how you got into certain rooms where you had been the first Black person there, and just that little bit starts to change the work of the organization. That's where those rooms are, where those seats are. I think it would be like really cool to think about, like, where are those other seats? Like, I think about like the government finance officers association. Like, who are the chief financial officers of all these cities, and where are those different places where they silently, kind of not silently, but quietly pass along best practices, quietly chit chat about what are the problems that are worth spending extra time on to kind of make your name in this field. City managers, there's another one where I've seen there's been a couple of amazing city managers I've met over the years. They're in Texas. They're working on issues like how to correct for the fact that all the low-income housing projects in Dallas are in the south side of the city, the historically Black part of the city, and we get nothing else anywhere else. Anyway, so we have some audience questions coming in, and I want to just remind our audience, yes, please do feel free to submit some questions. So on this topic, so we have one question about representation and about where is there education policy anywhere you've seen at the state or local levels, community colleges, any education policy or initiatives that have been helpful in increasing representation in the fields that kind of hold this silent power over property and spatial justice. I'll just toss that out there. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about developers or lawyers or sociologists even.
I can go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, Michael, you go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I mean, one thing that I have seen more and more recently, which I applaud, and I don't think it's wide enough yet, is that when making explicit as part of recruitment plans, I know this is in our policies, is to explicitly reach out to historically Black colleges and universities and Latino serving institutions, because I think that oftentimes those, again, are resources where, as Thomas said, we're often thinking about, in terms of deprivation, but there's an incredible amount of innovation and education that goes on in those institutions. And I don't think we use them as resources. You can not use them extractively, but use them in terms of recruitment pools for folks to bring in to places that traditionally haven't been places. It's kind of been limited to a few professions where there's been a lot of recruitment out of those institutions. But I think we could do a whole lot more. And then one thing I wanted to mention for my own work is I think that there's an incredible opportunity for intergenerational transfer here, interracially. So not just focusing, and basically one of the things always is hard about representation is it calls on people like Thomas and Megan to be the first people in the room, and there's a role for us white folks to do this too. And one of the things that's happening is that in a lot of neighborhoods that have been integrated, white flight doesn't really happen so much anymore. From my own research, a lot of times what happens is white folks will stay in a neighborhood, but new white folks won't move in as people of color move in. So as the neighborhood becomes integrated, it becomes less attractive to white folks. And I think that there are incredible opportunities for nonprofits. And again, I think this is where institutions can come in. You know, if a hospital comes in and sets up an explicit intergenerational program, that's going to transfer, you know, knowledge from the folks who are there, and it might be across race, it might be across gender, it might be across, you know, other places. And I think that it's problematic when we say it's only for Black folks to, or people of color to do this. I think white folks need to be part of this too, and making sure that people of color are in the room when we're in there, but also making sure that we're finding people of color to help, you know, transfer what skills and knowledge we have. So I just wanted to mention that as something that, you know, I don't want it to just end up as tokenism in the long run.
Yeah, and I just, you know, in terms of some of these pipelines, I mean, I'm actually the product of a pipeline program that was started in 1972 at the University of Wisconsin Law School to try to get more people of color to be law professors. And so I'm always very thankful of that program and the incredible professor who started it, a man by the name of Jim Jones. But in terms of this estate planning, there's you know, probably the most elite organization in the United States of those estate planning lawyers and estate planning counsel, something called the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel. And they've just funded a couple small programs to try to increase the pipeline of minority students to think about a career in kind of in estate planning. So you see kind of a success there. I mean, one of the things I'm really proud of is not only was this initial model state statute, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, I mean, even among the organization that promulgated it, they thought it was going to be a total failure. They were thinking that, you know, it was the fact that it was dealing with the issue of racial justice was kind of noble in theory, but it would prove fatal in fact, right? They kind of assumed what happened in all those southern states beginning in the 70s when that was going to be. Well, now it's turned out of their real property acts, they've done about 42, 43. It's now the fifth most successful. And what I'm happy is that I did kind of catalyze this initiative to get these grassroots and community-based organizations into the room. It was the first time that the Uniform Law Commission, which is the organization, ever had such grassroots and community-based participation. Culturally, they went through a little bit of a change because I think they were not used to. In some ways, they almost looked at these groups as kind of a nuisance in their process. But given the success of our Model Property Act, our Partition Act, I then proposed a second model act that they accepted last year. We had the first drafting meeting for that Friday and Saturday. And instead of kind of considering these grassroots groups, many of them people of color, as a nuisance, they welcomed them into the process because they realized that maybe their products would be better informed if they got the feedback from those communities that are experiencing these problems. And so something that was kind of uncomfortable 14 years ago as they were kind of culturally going through, has now been normalized. And, you know, I just thought that that was tremendous. I mean, the last thing I'd say on that is, you know, up to this point, at least in my work, I've done a lot of my law reform and policy work. It's not really been considered part of my compensated job. So it's, I always say I have two jobs, my compensated one and my impact work, which happens to be uncompensated. But that's not a model for addressing these kind of legal issues impacting these communities at any scale. So, you know, one of the things I'm trying to do in the next couple years is build an institute. And one of the things it would have is what I call a law and policy shop, where there would be staff. We could look at these property issues, the legal parts of it in a very systemic way, and, you know, and take it to scale. Yeah.
Can you say, Thomas, what's the new law that you're working on?
Yeah, so it's, heirs property is a subset of what we call tenancy and common ownership, which is the most prevalent form of what we call common real property ownership in the United States. it actually has a number of manifestations. The first one is the one that the Associated Press highlighted in 2001, this forced sale where, real estate speculator buys out one family member only to turn around and force a sale of the entire property. But there's a number of other manifestations of the problem. So one of the other manifestations is what I call gridlocked ownership, that once you own heirs property, mostly through not making a will or estate plan, you can essentially become locked into this form of ownership because the form of ownership requires, if you're going to make any significant change to the management of the property or the use of the property, it requires 100% agreement among all of the fractional ownership interests. And for African Americans, it's not unusual to have this property pass from one generation to another without a will or estate plan. And you can often have, 25, 50, 100, 200 members of the ownership group. And if you have to get 100% agreement, it's going to render it impossible to make any change. And so what I say is that if you're a wealthy family in the United States and you want to own property together, there's many different legal forms or entity structures, an LLC, a trust, a partnership. You can also develop your own rules for tenancy in common. That's what we call private ordering. But no business lawyer, estate planning attorney that a family would come to would ever recommend the heirs property form of ownership. They would say, run as far away from that as possible. And so what this second act is seeking to do is lower the threshold to enable a certain percentage of the owners to decide to change their ownership structure to an LLC or what we sometimes call a tenancy in common agreement. So they could have a form that's much more stable and that much better allocates rights and responsibilities, and then also enables people to use the property. A lot of these African-American families in the South, they have property that has great forestry potential, but because they have to get 100% agreement, and sometimes it's not just inter-family conflict, it's they cannot locate one of the distant relatives, because with heirs property, actually, a lot of the owners are spread throughout the United States because of northern migration. And they can't locate. And so they're fundamentally locked in. So one of the shorthands I said is that these families ended up owning heirs property because of Jim Crow, and their inability to get out of it is a present manifestation of Jim Crow.
Still living with that legacy. Wow. I want to have Megan weigh in on this too if she can, but let me ask you, Thomas, really quickly. The pipeline program you'd mentioned, you were in that program in 1972. Is it when you got into that program, I think you said?
No, I'm not that old. There was this incredible professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, first African-American person of color ever hired. And he basically, when he got on the faculty of Wisconsin, he realized that most predominantly white law faculties across the country had erected barriers to prevent the legal academy from diversifying. And there was a narrative that these minority attorneys who had done very well in law school were not qualified. And so he disagreed with that, but then he basically said, okay, what do you mean they're not qualified? He said, well, they don't know about developing a research agenda. So the academic kind of speak. So he said, fine, I'm going to create a program where we're going to give them all of that. They can speak the academic language. They have a research agenda. They could have a publication when they go on the market or two. And it's really that. So I got the fellowship and completed it in 1999. But it's, there's been a number of incredible people have come through that program, including Kim Crenshaw. It's called the Hasty Fellowship. Yeah. Okay.
So you were in 1999, and when did the first state adopt the model law for heirs property that you worked on? What year was that?
Yeah, so we finalized the act in 2010. The ABA had to get its sign off, which it did in 2011. And then either right away in 2011 or 12, we had a random state, a state that I don't know that there was great partition abuse, but we had a network of important stakeholders, and it was Nevada. which, even getting Nevada, because the cynics had said we would fail everywhere. That actually helped us. And so, but then we've been, we have it in, like the South has 8, but we have it in every region. The most recent state that 2 months ago enacted a lot is California. But we got, I always say, it's from Hawaii to Florida, from New York to New Mexico, 3 Midwestern states thrown in. So.
Well, I don't know if you would consider this a fair question, but I would wonder if any of the funders on this call would consider a grant funding cycle that goes 13 years, like 1999 to 2012. Would you fund somebody to work on something for 13 years to see what happens? Because sometimes it takes that long. But once you get to that 13th year, like you said, now you've got 18 states and you're rolling. You've got other things, but who funds something for 13 years? So yeah, Megan, if you want to add to the pipeline question, any promising developments in that space?
Yeah, I was gonna say not necessarily educational policy, but I do think philanthropic organizations, large philanthropic organizations are, after the summer's events, George Floyd, I think it was really hard for people to continue to look away and not see the real benefit of investing in Black-owned, people of color-owned or led local organizations and community development corporations. And so a lot of large philanthropic organizations like the Kresge Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we're seeing have particular focus now on Black and Brown led development organizations and corporations. And I think that's a huge change and shift that I think is really critically important, and one that we're also talking about at Enterprise, because we know, again, right, that this representation and that these locally led and based organizations have huge value and impact in the community directly, and that investment, right, versus thinking about where money is going, but thinking about or money going out of the community, but how do we better invest into community, I think is one of the most impactful ways that we're going to see change as far as like pipelining money into community. But as far as educational policy, I'm not as familiar with. But hope there is more out there, because I went to the United States Military Academy undergrad and was probably one at my time when I graduated of 3,000 Black graduates of the Academy ever. And so I was involved in a pipeline program after graduation that I think was critically important to thinking about, one, the ways in which we think about representation and why that matters and how we do that and make belonging a priority for different organizations to actually attract Black and Brown talent.
Yeah. Another one I think about, it's not really an initiative to support them, but there is an initiative out there called the First 500. It's the First 500 to recognize the first 500 licensed Black women architects in the United States. And there aren't 500 yet. I think they're getting close. I think they're over 400, but I think they may be very close if they may have just reached it. I should have checked before this, but yeah, they're in all of the architects who have been licensed. I mean, there have been folks who might have considered themselves, or we should consider architects, but they weren't licensed by the licensing AIA or the licensing authorities for architecture throughout history. But yeah, it's called the First 500, and they may have just they're approaching that First 500. I think licensed Black women architects, and it says a lot about the architecture profession's ability to kind of serve different communities. Similar issues in the planning profession too, in terms of more adjacent professions to this world of like who gets to govern and distribute and develop land and work and finance real estate transactions and developments. There's lawyers, there's developers, there's architects, there's planners, there's policymakers, and the lack of representation is one of the ways it manifests. And Megan's, yes, they did hit the first 500. It looks like there are now 500 licensed Black women architects across the country. We have a couple of minutes remaining. And some questions flowing through here. One thing I would want to, if we could do sort of a lightning round to kind of wrap this up. There's always new solutions proposed, even passed in Congress. Most recently under the Trump administration, there was the Opportunity Zones tax incentive program. There's also, before that, in community development, there hasn't been much, but there was new markets tax credits, there was CRA, even longer before that. Even just having Black banks around, if anyone's read The Color of Money by Mesa Baradaran, you can read the history in that book of how Black banks have often been used as a distraction, as a sort of like consolation prize. Okay, we're gonna give you 40 acres and a mule. Actually, no, we're not going to take the 40 acres back, but we're going to give you a bank. It's called Freedman's Bank. That's what you get instead of the 40 acres and a mule. And then, but that bank is not going to be allowed to actually make loans to Black people. It's only going to be allowed to buy mortgage-backed securities or fund mortgages to white folks, even though it's got a bunch of Black folks' deposits in there. Anyway, that's a whole story about Black banks. Are there some solutions that are sort of your pet peeves out there that are sort of purported to look to address this problem of spatial injustice, but just miss the mark? Opportunity zones is a big one for me, just because of the way it's structured. I can talk all day about that, but let me go to you guys. I don't know who wants to jump in first. Michael, you want to jump in first?
I have one that I think is going to be really important with the new administration and the infrastructure bill. I think it's a great idea to get rid of highways in cities for lots of reasons, but I don't think it's going to help. The harms that were done 50 years ago, you're not going to be able to all of a sudden, bring those communities back. And so the kinds of root shock that Mindy Fuller-Love has talked about has happened. And unless we're focusing on the communities of color and where they are now, those programs are going to spend billions of dollars that are, probably going to help developers and help investors, but not necessarily help the communities of color where they are now, and to help them be to accentuate and value what joy and happiness and the strengths that are in those communities now.
Yeah, I'll say one is kind of a positive development, but it's potentially limiting. So another problem with heirs property ownership is most heirs property owners lack clear title, which renders them inability to use their property as collateral to get a commercial loan or to participate in a wide range of governmental programs at the local, county, state, and federal level. For decades, FEMA had a rule that to qualify for disaster relief, you needed clear record title, which then negatively impacted the ability of African Americans and others to recover from a disaster. FEMA just has draft rules that is going to change that, is going to enable people to have evidence of ownership except for recorded title. That's good. But there's still a ton of heirs property owners who were not qualified in the past for disaster relief. And it would be great if those owners could actually be deemed qualified for damage that already has happened. So I think that, it's kind of a double-edged sword. And, I think the other thing is, well, let me stop. I want to make sure that Megan has time. Michael.
I think one of the most impactful is opportunity zones. And we supported and helped to develop some of the opportunity zone policy and advocated for certain things at Enterprise. And I think without specific guidelines and stipulations around the ways and the process, again, in ways in which we want to use that capital, we're again going to lean on our conventional narratives and the ways in which we do business as usual, which is going to disproportionately impact negatively the same people that are always impacted, and there will be the same winners and losers as we typically see. And so I think there's lots of opportunity with opportunity zones if we could get a little clearer about what its uses are and stipulations and regulatory guidelines are.
Right. All right. Well, I wish we could talk about this all day, but we are at time. And so I want to thank our panelists, Thomas, Michael, and Megan. Yeah, give yourselves a hand. This was great. Really appreciate your perspectives and the work that you guys have been doing. I hope folks will be able to follow it in different ways on social media or email or however you typically get your information. And I'm gonna, I guess, wrap up for today. So thank you all for watching the first day of this 2-day workshop on spatial justice as a driver of health in the context of chronic and acute societal emergencies. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow at 11 a.m. for day 2 of the event, looking at public spaces and looking at a little bit more of the practical side of like what to do about all these challenges and specific barriers that we're talking about today. So again, thank you everyone. Appreciate the National Academies of Medicine for bringing us in and hosting this discussion. I think it's been really interesting today, and looking forward to a little bit more tomorrow. And that's a wrap, guys. Thank you very much. And yeah, have a good rest of the day.